Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel IB Made Easy by Garima Chhabra. This video is part 2 of second chapter of macroeconomics. In the previous video we discussed about aggregate demand. In this video we are going to study aggregate supply. Aggregate supply first of all is planned output. It is a planned level of output that domestic firms are willing and able to provide at different average price level during that period of time. It is not same as real GDP because real GDP is the actual output, whereas aggregate supply is planned. Now, when we talk about the shape of aggregate supply curve, we have two views. One, Monetarist or new classical model, and second is Keynesian view. We are going to study aggregate supply from both these perspectives. First is aggregate supply under monetarist or new classical model. So the difference, the main point here is that monetarist view sees two aggregate supply curves. Two different aggregate supply curve, one for the short run and second for the long run. So here we have two supply curves, short run aggregate supply curve and long run aggregate supply curve. Let's discuss SRAS first. Before knowing SRAS, we must understand the difference between short run and long run. In the short run, we assume that our cost of factors of production is constant. So here wage rate and state of technology is fixed. It does not change. So accordingly, SRAS is that planned national output at different price level holding productivity and cost of factor inputs constant. That level of national output when the cost of factor inputs and productivity is constant, we cannot change it. Now, if we draw SRAS curve, because general price and aggregate supply curve, they have positive relation, so the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. On x-axis we show real GDP and on y-axis general price level. Because of the positive relation between general price and aggregate supply, the SRAS curve is upward sloping. It is price elastic because of the spare capacity available. This point we are going to discuss in detail further. Now, determinants of SRAS. What are determinants? Determinants are those factors which brings a change in the aggregate supply. These are divided into two parts. First is cost of factors of production and second is indirect tax. So, cost of factors of production first includes labor cost. If labor cost increases, cost of production increases, which means profits decreases, and that means less incentive to work. So aggregate supply also decreases. Same is the case with raw material. If the raw material costs increases, cost of production will increase and profits will decrease, leading to decrease in the aggregate supply. Then we have exchange rates. If exchange rate increases, that means there is appreciation in domestic currency. That means value of domestic currency has increased, which will make imports costlier. It will make imports cheaper. If the firms are buying raw materials from the abroad, then cheaper imports means cost of production decreases and hence profit increases, leading to increase in the aggregate supply. Then we have interest rates. If interest rates increases, firms' capacity to borrow, since the cost of borrowing is increasing, so the capacity to borrow will decrease. That means loans will decrease and people will invest. People here means firms. Firms will invest less, decreasing the aggregate supply. Then we have bureaucracy and administration. If there are strict rules and regulations and legal things, then aggregate supply will definitely decrease because of the all the hustle created by these rules and regulations. Whereas if the policies, rules, laws are lenient, aggregate supply will increase. These were the part of cost of factors of production. Then we have indirect tax. So indirect taxes are the taxes which are basically charged on your expenses. This basically is the tax which increases the cost of production if charged on the raw material, and also increases the price for the customers as well. That means if indirect tax increases, cost of production will increase. Increasing cost of production will reduce the profits and hence aggregate supply will decrease. It was all about the determinants of SRAS curve. Now, what is the impact of determinants on the graph? Let's suppose this is aggregate demand curve. This is aggregate supply curve. Whenever there is a change in the determinant, let's say labor cost increased and hence aggregate supply decreased, the change in this determinant will shift aggregate supply curve either to leftward or rightward. If the change is favorable, the aggregate curve will shift to right. This is in case of favorable shift. And in this case, real GDP will increase from Q to Q1 and general price will decrease from P to P1. And if there is unfavorable change, in case of unfavorable change, aggregate supply curve will shift to left, as was the case with the labor cost. Labor cost increased and hence aggregate supply curve shifted to left, leading to increase in the general price and decrease in the real GDP. There's a difference between movement along aggregate supply curve and shift in aggregate supply curve. This was shift in aggregate supply curve. If we talk about movement along aggregate supply curve, it looks like this. This is aggregate demand curve. This is aggregate supply curve. So because of some reason, aggregate demand curve increased. Earlier we were on point A. Real GDP was Q, whereas general price was P. But because of increase in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply shifted from point A to point B, hence increasing the quantity as well as price. But here we have only one aggregate supply curve and we are moving from one point on this aggregate supply curve to another. This is movement along SRAS. Whereas in the shift, aggregate supply curve itself was shifting. Now the slope of SRAS depends on the spare capacity. How much capacity is not utilized yet. If the there is spare capacity, that means it is underutilized, we can increase the output without increasing the general price. That means when there is elastic aggregate supply curve, we can increase the output without increasing the general price. But when there is less spare capacity, we can increase the output, but it will increase the general price level as well. Now next we have LRAS, long run aggregate supply curve. It is basically the maximum level of output that can be produced given the resources in the economy are fully employed. That means none of the resource is underutilized or unemployed. This is the LRAS curve. It shows that this is the maximum quantity we can produce, and at this point all the resources are fully employed. Now let's suppose this is aggregate demand curve. This is the price. If in this case we aggregate demand increases, aggregate demand curve shifts to right, the price will shift, price will increase. It will create inflationary pressure. We cannot increase the output because now we don't have any spare capacity, no resource, no FOP is under or unemployed. So at LRAS, even if the aggregate demand increases, it will only lead to increase in the general price level. There will be no increase in the quantity. Then how can LRAS shift? Is there a possibility? Yes. You must have studied this under PPC as well. LRAS can be shifted if the quality and quantity of FOPs are increased. Quality means efficiency increases basically, and quantity means obviously the numbers. Or technology improves. It's basically same. What happens? This is the graph, real GDP, general price. So this is LRAS. It can be shifted only and only when quality quantity of FOPs increases or technology advances. It is basically similar to PPC shifting rightwards. Now we have, this was new classical or Monetarist view. Now we have aggregate supply curve from the perspective of Keynesian. So it's Keynesian view. The only difference here is that it does not consider different time period. It only says that there is one aggregate supply curve. You can see the picture, you can see the graph here. Here we have this aggregate supply curve is basically divided into three sections. In section 1, the aggregate supply curve is a horizontal line, which means at this price quantity can be increased, and if the price is changed, quantity can be decreased to 0. That means aggregate supply curve is perfectly elastic, which means this scenario happens when there is plenty of spare capacity left. There are so many unemployed resources, and in this case, let's suppose aggregate demand is here And in this case, if aggregate demand increases, if we are in this section only, we can increase the aggregate demand curve without increasing the price. General price remains same. See, quantity has increased, but the price is still same. It is because of the spare capacity available. Then in the second section, we have the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. That means it is elastic now. If aggregate demand increases and goes to this section, here the spare capacity is there, but there is pressure on it. That means spare capacity has started to decrease. So here, if the aggregate demand increases to this level, aggregate supply will obviously increase, increasing the quantity, but general price will increase. Here quantity will also increase, here also quantity will increase. Then in section third, if aggregate's demand curve shifts here, this is the area where aggregate supply is vertical. That means it is perfectly inelastic. Here demand cannot be changed with a change in the price. So aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Even if we increases the aggregate demand, there will only be increase in the general price level and no increase in the capacity. No increase in the quantity. We cannot increase the quantity because this is the maximum level of output that can be produced in the economy, and hence it creates inflationary pressure. After this, if again the aggregate demand curve shifts, it is only increasing the price, but the quantity remains same. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know your doubts and the topics that you want me to discuss in the comment section. Like, share and subscribe to watch more such videos.